When I turned 17, my parents told me I'd be marrying my 28-year-old cousin Thomas the day after graduation to preserve our family's superior bloodline through strategic breeding. My mother took me to an unlicensed doctor who examined my reproductive system and declared me optimal for childbearing, while Thomas visited weekly to discuss how many children we'd have. The night they showed up with sedatives and leather restraints to move the wedding up because I'd found grandmother's hidden diary. Warning that girls who refused were killed, I knew I had to run. When I turned 17, my parents told me I'd be marrying my cousin Thomas the day after graduation because our family needed to preserve our superior bloodline through strategic breeding. My mother came from a wealthy Southern family that still acted like the Civil War never ended and believed they carried special genes that made them natural-born leaders. Dad was a geneticist who'd been fired from 3 universities for his racial theories, but continued his research in our basement laboratory. They'd spent my whole childhood collecting DNA samples from family members and creating breeding charts that covered our dining room walls. According to their calculations, Thomas and I would produce children with the highest concentration of what they called founding stock genetics. Thomas was 28 and had been grooming me since I was 12 under the guise of cousin bonding time. He'd take me on drives where he'd explain how lucky I was to be chosen as his future breeding partner and describe in detail how many children we'd have. 6 minimum, he'd say while rubbing my shoulder. Maybe 8 if your hips develop properly. My parents encouraged these meetings and would leave us alone in the house for hours despite my obvious discomfort. Mom would dress me up before he arrived and remind me to be sweet to my future husband. They'd already picked out the wedding venue at our family's old plantation and sent save the dates to other families in their genetic preservation network. The planning accelerated when I turned 17 and they started preparing me for my breeding duties. Mom took me to a special doctor who examined my reproductive system and declared me optimal for childbearing. This doctor wasn't licensed anymore, but my parents trusted him because he shared their beliefs about racial purity and genetic superiority. He prescribed vitamins to enhance my fertility and gave my parents a breeding calendar marked with my most fertile days. Thomas started visiting more frequently and would openly discuss our future children's genetics at family dinners. Our firstborn will have the perfect Nordic features, he'd announce while my parents beamed with pride. We're going to restore this family to its former glory through selective breeding. I tried telling teachers at school, but my parents had already spread the story that I was mentally fragile and prone to making up lies for attention. They'd donated so much money to the school that administrators wouldn't risk losing their funding by investigating. When I begged my older brother for help, he just shrugged and said he'd married his second cousin last year, so what was the big deal? The whole family was in on this sick tradition and treated me like a prize heifer being prepared for market. Mom started homeschooling me senior year to prevent outside influence and keep me under constant supervision. She'd make me read books about genetic superiority and quiz me on family bloodlines going back 10 generations. The isolation was suffocating, and I spent hours staring out my bedroom window, planning escape routes that seemed impossible. Everything changed when I found my grandmother's hidden diary in the attic while looking for escape money. She'd documented decades of forced marriages and what happened to girls who refused. 3 of my aunts had tried to run away and been brought back for correction procedures that left them unable to have children. Another cousin who'd fallen in love with someone outside the approved genetic pool had died in a suspicious accident 2 weeks before her forced wedding. The diary contained names and dates and photos of bruised girls who'd tried to resist. My grandmother had helped several escape but was caught and subjected to electroshock therapy until she forgot their names. The last entry was a warning to any girl who found this. They will kill you before they let you contaminate the bloodline. Each page revealed another horror about my family's breeding program and the lengths they'd go to preserve their twisted legacy. I contacted one of the escaped cousins using a code from the diary, and she told me about an underground network that helped girls from families like ours. She'd been living under a fake identity for 10 years, but said the freedom was worth always looking over her shoulder. We arranged for her to pick me up during Thomas's next visit, when my parents would be distracted by wedding preparations. The plan was simple but required perfect timing, and I spent days memorizing every detail. But somehow they found out about the diary and the escape plan. When Thomas arrived that day, he wasn't alone. He'd brought 2 other cousins and medical equipment that made my blood freeze. Mom locked the doors while Dad explained they'd moved up the wedding to tonight because I'd proven myself too unstable to wait any longer. We'll do the ceremony first, Dad said, pulling out leather restraints from a medical bag. Then Thomas will consummate immediately to ensure pregnancy before you try anything else stupid. They started setting up an IV drip, and Thomas smiled at me while preparing a syringe. Don't worry, cousin. The sedatives will make you more cooperative for breeding. I backed against the wall, but there was nowhere to run with 3 men blocking every exit. Mom held my arms while Thomas approached with the needle. Just a little prick, he whispered, and then you'll be mine forever. My body moved before my brain could catch up, and I drove my knee hard into Thomas's groin with all the force I could manage. He dropped the syringe and doubled over, gasping, while I twisted free from Mom's grip and grabbed the diary from the table. Dad lunged at me, but I ducked under his arms and ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Behind me, Mom screamed for the other cousins to catch me while Thomas groaned on the floor, still clutching himself. I reached the upstairs bathroom and slammed the door shut, jamming a chair under the doorknob just as footsteps pounded up the stairs. The door shook as they threw their weight against it, and I could hear Dad telling someone to get his toolbox from the garage. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and typed Rachel's emergency number with the message we'd agreed on. The bathroom window was already cracked open from my practice runs, and I pushed it wider, hearing metal scraping as Dad worked on the door hinges. I climbed onto the toilet, then the sink counter, and squeezed through the window frame, dropping onto the garage roof below. My ankle twisted when I landed, but I kept moving, sliding down to the garden shed roof, then jumping to the ground. The bathroom door crashed open above me, and Thomas's voice rang out telling everyone I was in the backyard. I ran toward the tree line, knowing every path and hiding spot from years of exploring this property alone. The woods were dark, but I knew the creek path by heart and followed it deeper into the trees. Behind me, flashlight beams cut through the darkness, and I could hear the men spreading out trying to box me in. My phone buzzed with Rachel's reply saying she'd be at the old bridge in 5 minutes. My twisted ankle throbbed with each step, but I pushed through the pain knowing this was my only chance. The bridge came into view, but no car was waiting, and panic flooded my chest. Branches cracked nearby, and then headlights appeared, but it was Dad's truck, not Rachel's Honda. I pressed myself behind the concrete bridge support, holding my breath as he drove slowly past, sweeping a spotlight across the trees. His CB radio crackled with Thomas coordinating the search pattern and telling someone to check the gas station down the road. After the truck passed, I stayed frozen for another minute before more headlights appeared from the opposite direction. Rachel's gray Honda pulled up, and I sprinted from my hiding spot. spot, yanking the back door open and diving inside. She hit the gas before I even got the door closed, and we passed Dad's truck heading back toward the bridge. I laid flat on the back seat, not daring to breathe as our vehicles passed within feet of each other. Rachel kept driving steady and calm while I stayed down for another 10 minutes until she said it was safe to sit up. 2 hours later, we pulled into a truck stop, and I locked myself in a bathroom stall, finally able to look at grandmother's diary again. The pages about the safe houses were water damaged, but I could make out addresses in 3 different states. Rachel knocked gently, saying we needed to keep moving, and I realized I'd left my phone in her car. My ankle had swollen inside my shoe, and each step sent sharp pain up my leg, but I followed her back to the Honda. She drove through the night explaining the network's rules while I watched the mountains fade behind us. No contact with anyone from our past for 6 months minimum while they built a legal case. New identity documents would be waiting at the safe house along with a lawyer who specialized in these situations. They'd helped dozens of girls escape from families like mine and knew how to keep us hidden. I watched the familiar landscape disappear, knowing I could never go back even if I wanted to. The next morning we stopped at a diner 3 states away, and I tried to force down scrambled eggs while Rachel made phone calls. The TV above the counter played local news, but there was no mention of a missing girl. I wondered if my family had even called the police, or if they were handling this internally like grandmother's diary described. Rachel's phone rang constantly, and she stepped outside to take calls from network contacts. When she came back, her face was tense, and she explained they were activating emergency protocols. My family had connections in law enforcement across multiple states, and the network had intercepted chatter about roadblocks. We needed to switch cars immediately and take a different route to the safe house. Why does the family keep such detailed records if they're doing something they know is wrong? The grandmother's diary, the breeding charts on the walls, the DNA samples, they're documenting evidence of their own crimes. 3 other girls had escaped similar situations just this year, and the network was stretched thin, protecting everyone. Rachel paid the check, and we walked to the parking lot where a blue sedan was waiting with the keys under the mat. The woman who'd left it was long gone, but Rachel said she was another survivor who'd been free for 5 years now. We transferred my bag and the diary to the new car and left the Honda for someone else to pick up later. As we drove away, I thought about those other girls running from their own versions of Thomas and breeding programs. The network existed because this happened more than anyone wanted to admit. Families with money and twisted beliefs forcing their daughters into genetic preservation schemes. Rachel said some of the girls came from religious compounds while others escaped from wealthy families like mine. All of us running from people who saw us as breeding stock instead of human beings. Rachel pulled into a rest stop about 2 hours later, and my stomach dropped when I saw the state trooper's car parked near the entrance. The officer was standing by his cruiser studying something on his phone and then looking up at each car that passed. Rachel saw him too, and her whole body went stiff, but she kept driving slowly toward the parking spots like nothing was wrong. She pulled into a space far from the trooper and grabbed her phone, typing fast while keeping her head down. "Bathroom," she said quietly, and we got out walking normal even though my legs felt like jelly. The trooper started moving toward Rachel's Honda, and I wanted to run, but Rachel grabbed my arm, keeping me steady. We went into the women's room, and she led me past the stalls to a door marked "Maintenance Only" that she pushed open without stopping. Another woman was waiting there with keys to a minivan, and Rachel pushed me toward her while looking back at the main door. We hurried across the back lot to the van where the woman, Carol, was already starting the engine. Carol drove calm and steady while Rachel watched behind us, and after 10 minutes, she finally relaxed her shoulders. Carol told me she'd escaped from her own family 20 years ago when they tried to make her marry her uncle. She explained how my parents had already filed a kidnapping report, saying Rachel was part of a cult that stole young girls. The news was calling me a victim of brainwashing, and my parents were on every channel crying about their missing daughter. This was how these families always played it, making the escapees look crazy so nobody would believe our stories. 3 days later, I was sitting in a small apartment trying to remember my new name was Sarah Mills. The network's lawyer, a woman who wouldn't tell me her real name, handed me a stack of paper and told me to write everything. She said the details about the breeding program needed to be documented while they were still fresh in my mind. My hand cramped after 20 pages, but I kept writing about Thomas and the vitamins and the doctor visits. The lawyer came back with her laptop and showed me the news articles about my disappearance. My parents looked perfect on camera, with Mom dabbing her eyes and Dad's voice breaking as he begged for my return. The comments were all sympathy for them, calling me selfish and ungrateful for running away from such loving parents. One commenter said I was probably on drugs, and another said kids today don't appreciate good families. Nobody questioned why a 17-year-old would run away from parents who seemed so caring on TV. The lawyer said this was standard procedure for families like mine who knew how to control the story. Then the burner phone rang, and it was Lucas saying Mom had collapsed from stress and was in the hospital. He begged me to at least call and let them know I was alive because Mom might not make it. My hand was reaching for the phone when Rachel grabbed it and listened to Lucas keep talking. His voice changed when he realized I wasn't responding, and he said they had resources to find me with or without help. Rachel hung up, and within an hour we were packing because the call could be traced even on a burner. Carol drove us to another safe house, and during the drive she told me her story in short, flat sentences. Her family had forced her to have a baby at 15 with her mother's brother to keep their bloodline pure. She escaped after giving birth but had to leave her daughter, who was now 30, and continuing the tradition. The network had hundreds of these stories, girls and women who got out and others who didn't make it. A week after my escape, I was in my 4th safe house, unable to sleep because every sound made me jump. I kept checking the locks and reading pages from grandmother's diary to remind myself why I ran. One entry described a girl named Catherine who was found after 2 years of hiding and brought back for a basement wedding. The family kept her drugged for the ceremony, and 9 months later she had twins before disappearing completely. I couldn't stop thinking about Catherine and whether she was dead or locked in some family property having baby after baby. The network doctor came to examine me because I'd mentioned the vitamin shots, and she found a small scar on my ankle. She said it looked surgical, but I didn't remember any operations, and then the x-ray showed something metal under the skin. The doctor's face went white when she realized it was a tracking chip that must have been put in during one of my medical exams. She had to remove it immediately, but when she cut it out, she found 2 chips nested together like Russian dolls. The first one had been transmitting my location this whole time, but the second one was dormant until she removed the first. It activated with a loud beep and started broadcasting a stronger signal that would reach whoever was monitoring. The doctor said we had maybe 30 minutes before someone showed up and the whole network went into emergency mode. Rachel drove fast toward another safe house, but at an intersection, I saw Dad's truck and my whole body went cold. Thomas was in the passenger seat and 2 cousins were in the back, all of them checking cars at the red light. light. Rachel yanked the wheel hard into a parking garage, and the tires screamed as we went up the ramp too fast. She pulled into a spot, and we ran for the stairwell, our footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. We burst out of the stairwell into the main level, and Rachel grabbed my arm to slow me down so we wouldn't look suspicious. The bus station was only 3 blocks away, but every person we passed made my heart pound harder. Rachel kept checking behind us while I pulled my hood up and tried to look normal even though my hands were shaking. At the corner, she stopped at a payphone and made a quick call while I watched for Dad's truck. She hung up and we walked fast toward the Greyhound sign ahead. The station was crowded with people dragging suitcases, and I stayed close to Rachel as she bought my ticket with cash. She handed me a driver's license with my photo, but a different name and birthday that made me 21. The departure board showed my bus leaving in 10 minutes from gate 12. Rachel walked me to the gate, then stopped and looked at me hard. "Remember the codes I taught you," she said quietly. "Trust nobody until you verify them through the network site." She squeezed my shoulder, then walked away fast toward the parking lot. I got in line behind an old woman with a huge bag and watched Rachel through the window as she got into a different car than we'd arrived in. The bus driver took my ticket without really looking at me, and I found a seat in the back corner where I could see everyone. Rachel's car pulled out heading north while my bus would go south, and I pressed my face against the cold window watching her disappear. More passengers got on, and I pulled my hood lower, studying each face for anyone familiar. The bus finally pulled out, and I gripped grandmother's diary in my backpack, feeling its weight against my leg. 10 days into my escape, and I was alone for the first time since that night in the basement. The highway stretched ahead, and I opened the diary to a page I'd marked earlier. Catherine's story was written in grandmother's shaky handwriting, and it made my stomach turn. She'd escaped in 1987 and made it 6 months before her brothers found her working at a diner in Oregon. They dragged her back, and grandmother heard screaming from the basement for 3 weeks straight. After that, Catherine was never seen again, but grandmother found bloody sheets in the burn pile. The entry ended with grandmother's note that Catherine had been pregnant by someone outside the bloodline when they caught her. I closed the diary and watched the miles pass, telling myself I wouldn't end up like Catherine. At the transfer station in Tennessee, I had 4 hours to wait for my next bus. The station was smaller than I expected, and I found a corner seat where I could watch both entrances. An hour in, I spotted my cousin Marcus interviewing drivers near the ticket counter, and my whole body went cold. He was showing them something, probably my photo, and writing down their answers. I walked slow to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall, pulling out the burner phone Rachel had given me. The network contact answered on the second ring, and I whispered what was happening. They told me to buy a ticket for the opposite direction, ride it 2 stops, then double back tomorrow on a different route. I waited 20 minutes, then walked out like nothing was wrong. Marcus was still at the ticket counter, but facing away from the departure gates. I bought a ticket to Memphis and boarded just as Marcus turned toward my original gate. Through the window, I watched him checking passengers on the other bus while mine pulled away. 2 days later, I finally arrived at the new safe house, a small ranch home with an American flag out front. Talk about family reunions nobody wants. They're literally hunting her with tracking chips like she's a lost pet instead of a person who said no to marrying her cousin. The elderly couple who answered looked like somebody's sweet grandparents with matching sweaters and warm smiles. They brought me inside, and the woman made me tea while the man explained they'd both escaped breeding programs 40 years ago. Over pot roast, they told me my family was part of a network spanning 12 states with thousands of members who believed in genetic purity. The woman showed me scars on her arms from when her family tried to breed her with her uncle at 15. They dedicated their retirement to helping girls like us escape and had saved 14 so far. The next morning, they drove me to the courthouse to file for an emergency protective order. The judge seemed kind at first, nodding as I explained about the forced marriage and breeding program, but when I mentioned the family names involved, his whole face changed. He shuffled papers and said there wasn't enough evidence of immediate danger. As he denied the order, I saw his nameplate clearly for the first time. Harrison was one of the allied families grandmother had listed in her diary. He knew exactly who I was and what I was running from. Back at the safe house, I couldn't sleep, feeling trapped even with these kind people. 2 weeks had passed since my escape, and the elderly couple kept saying I was safe, but something felt wrong. At 3 in the morning, I woke up needing water and heard voices from the kitchen. I crept down the hall and pressed against the wall, listening to the man on the phone. "Yes, we have Emma," he said soft. "The real one, not another runaway using that name. We'll bring her in gently tomorrow after she trusts us more." My blood turned to ice, and I backed away silent to my room. These weren't network members, but bounty hunters hired to return runaways. I grabbed the diary in my backpack, opened the window, and climbed out in my pajamas. My bare feet hit the cold grass, and I ran toward the street, not looking back. Behind me, the back door opened, and flashlight beams swept the yard. I ran harder, my feet slapping the pavement as porch lights clicked on. Dogs started barking, and I heard car doors slamming back at the house. I turned random corners trying to lose them, and spotted an unlocked car in a driveway. I yanked the door open and dove into the back seat, pulling a forgotten jacket over myself. Through the window, I watched the elderly couple and 3 men spread out with flashlights, checking yards and garages. They searched for 2 hours while I lay frozen under the jacket, barely breathing. When they finally gave up, I stayed hidden until dawn started breaking. My feet were bleeding, and I had no shoes, but I couldn't stay there. I snuck out and walked until I found a library just opening its doors. The librarian barely looked at me as I went straight to the computers in the back. I typed in the network's emergency site and entered the codes Rachel had taught me. The screen loaded, and I searched for the elderly couple's names. There they were on the interceptor list with photos and everything. They'd been catching runaways for 15 years, paid by the families to act like helpful grandparents. I'd been off the real network's grid for 3 days, and they probably thought I'd been caught. I sat in a study room later, reading more of grandmother's diary about the fake network that had operated for decades. Some girls got returned to their families, but others just disappeared completely. The families funded both the real escapes and the fake ones, playing both sides to catch runners. There was no way to know who was real anymore. I stared at the phone on the wall, remembering the only number I'd memorized from before. Ms. June had been my counselor sophomore year, and she'd seemed worried about me despite my family's donations. She'd pulled me aside once and asked if everything was okay at home, but I'd been too scared to tell her. I picked up the phone and dialed, my hand shaking. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice exactly like I remembered. "Emma? Oh my God, is that really you?" she said fast. "The whole school thinks you joined some cult. Your parents said you ran off with some religious group." I took a deep breath and told her everything. The words came out in a rush, and I could hear her breathing change on the other end. She stayed quiet for almost a minute before saying she was coming to get me right now. I tried to tell her it was too dangerous, but she'd already hung up, and I heard a car engine starting through the phone before the line went dead. 3 weeks passed in that motel room with me jumping at every sound while she made arrangements to drive the 8 hours from her new teaching job. She pulled up in a beat-up Honda at dawn, and I barely recognized her with her hair dyed black and wearing clothes I'd never seen her in before. We drove for 2 hours before I noticed the black SUV staying exactly 3 cars behind us, no matter which lane we switched to. Ms. June glanced in the mirror, and her knuckles went white on the steering wheel, but her voice stayed calm when she told me she'd been watching my family since she noticed bruises on my arms last year. She documented everything in photos and kept copies of my essays where I'd hinted at what was happening at home. The SUV got closer, and I could see Thomas's face through the windshield as Ms. June took the exit toward the police station without signaling. Thomas followed us right into the parking lot and jumped out of his car before we'd even stopped moving. Inside the station, he put on his concerned cousin act perfectly, while telling the desk sergeant I was mentally ill, and Ms. June was some predator who'd been grooming me online. He pulled out a folder thick with medical documents signed by 3 different doctors, all stating I had persecution complex and false memory syndrome from childhood trauma. The papers described detailed delusions about forced breeding programs and genetic experiments that supposedly existed only in my damaged mind. Officer Diana Torres took the documents and started reading while Thomas explained how my parents just wanted their sick daughter back for proper psychiatric treatment. Torres kept flipping through pages, and her eyebrows drew together when she noticed the dates didn't match up, and 2 of the signatures looked identical despite being from different doctors. She separated us into different rooms, and Thomas's friendly mask slipped for just a second when she said she needed to question us individually. My hands shook so bad I could barely hold the diary as I showed it to Torres page by page. Her face went pale when she read the entries about Officer Jim Paulson, who'd returned my cousin Melody 3 times before she finally disappeared. Torres put the diary down and made a phone call to someone named Jim, asking about traditional families and payment records from 5 years ago. I could hear shouting through the phone before she hung up and told me her former partner had just confessed to taking bribes to return runaway girls. She opened an official investigation right there and told Thomas he wasn't taking me anywhere while she contacted state authorities about potential trafficking. Thomas started screaming about family rights and how we'd regret interfering with their community, but Torres had 2 officers escort him out while she arranged protective custody. The women's shelter had bars on the windows and a security guard who checked everyone entering, but I still couldn't sleep that first night. Every footstep in the hallway made me clutch the diary tighter, and I kept reading my grandmother's final entry over and over. Trust no one completely. Always have another exit. The words felt like a warning specifically for me as I listened to other women crying through the thin walls. Torres came back the next morning with a federal agent named Janet Rodriguez, who specialized in cult deprogramming and human trafficking cases. Rodriguez had seen similar breeding programs in other states, but never with such detailed documentation as my grandmother's diary provided. She took photos of every page and entered them as evidence, while explaining how these networks operated across state lines, using medical professionals and law enforcement to maintain control. The investigation expanded quickly, and Rodriguez arranged for me to stay with a vetted foster family while they built the case against my parents. The Johnsons lived in a normal suburban house with 2 kids and a golden retriever who jumped on everyone who walked through the door. Mrs. Johnson showed me to a regular bedroom with windows that actually opened and locks that only worked from the inside. Nobody watched me constantly, or made me recite bloodlines, or measured my hips for breeding potential. It felt fake, like I was playing house while waiting for someone to drag me back to reality. They enrolled me in school under a protective identity, and I sat in calculus class trying to focus on derivatives, while the girl next to me complained about her parents not letting her go to a party. She had no idea I was supposed to be pregnant with my cousin's baby by now, according to my family's breeding schedule. A boy named Jake asked if I wanted to go to homecoming, and I almost laughed at how normal he thought my life was. Then Lucas appeared across the street from school one afternoon, just standing there watching me walk to the bus. My security detail moved toward him, but he held up a cardboard sign that said, "Mom in hospital. Please come home." He knew exactly how to make me doubt everything, because despite all they'd done, I still wondered if something had really happened to her. Rodriguez showed up at the foster home that night with recordings her team had pulled from my parents' phones through the investigation warrant. Dad's voice filled the room discussing retrieval plans for their breeding stock, meaning me and Thomas describing something called the basement protocol for forced insemination. Ms. June dyed her hair black and changed her whole look to help Emma. That's such smart thinking. How did she know to disguise herself like that before even picking Emma up? The FBI raid happened the next morning, and they found everything still there, including the genetic charts covering our dining room walls and the medical equipment in the basement laboratory. 3 days later, Rodriguez called me at the foster home to tell me what they found during the raid. The FBI team discovered sedatives and leather restraints in my parents' basement, along with detailed breeding schedules for 12 different girls in their network. They also found 3 pregnant teenagers living in the house who claimed they were there willingly, but Rodriguez said she recognized signs of Stockholm Syndrome in all of them. The case exploded beyond just my situation when they realized how many families were involved in this breeding program. I watched the news coverage from the Johnsons' living room as my parents stood outside the courthouse claiming religious persecution. Dad told reporters they were being targeted for their traditional values, while Mom cried about government overreach destroying American families. Several senators actually defended them on TV, calling it an attack on religious freedom and parental rights. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse with signs supporting family rights and traditional marriage values, which made me realize how powerful this network really was. 6 weeks after my escape, Mrs. Johnson started teaching me how to cook normal dinners without the strict genetic optimization rules I grew up with. We made spaghetti together, while I explained how every meal at home was designed for superior offspring production, with exact protein ratios and fertility-boosting supplements. She listened without judgment and offered me seconds without calculating calories or asking about my reproductive health like Mom always did. Rachel contacted me through Rodriguez, saying she'd been building a case with 12 other girls who escaped from families in the network. They were planning to testify together, but 2 girls had already recanted their statements after family pressure, and another one disappeared last week. The network's lawyers were formidable, with unlimited funding from generations of wealth and connections throughout the legal system. My deposition was scheduled for next month when the Johnsons' house got vandalized with "liar" spray painted across their garage and all the front windows broken. A note left in the mailbox threatened worse if I testified against my family and their sacred traditions. The Johnsons wanted to keep fostering me, but I couldn't let them get hurt because of me, so I asked Rodriguez for alternative placement. She moved me to a secure facility with other witnesses where I met Amy, who had escaped 5 years ago and been in hiding ever since. Amy showed me scars across her her abdomen from her correction procedure after she refused her arranged marriage at 16. They tried to remove her ovaries to prevent her from contaminating the bloodline, but she escaped mid-surgery while still bleeding. 2 months after my escape, I developed insomnia and started checking locks compulsively throughout the night at the facility. The therapist there prescribed anxiety medication, but I refused to take it, remembering all the vitamins my parents gave me that turned out to be fertility drugs. I read my grandmother's diary repeatedly, finding comfort in knowing someone else survived this nightmare, and tried to help others escape. Thomas got arrested on charges of attempted kidnapping and conspiracy, but made bail within hours paid by a religious freedom organization. I watched him on TV wearing a clean suit and claiming he was trying to save me from sex traffickers who had brainwashed me. During a supervised phone call with the Johnsons, I heard strange clicking sounds on the line that shouldn't have been there. The FBI discovered my calls were being traced despite their security protocols, which meant someone inside law enforcement was feeding information to the families. They moved me again with only 2 hours notice to pack my few belongings and say goodbye to Amy. Rodriguez uncovered financial records showing the breeding network had placed members in key positions across multiple states, including judges and police chiefs and doctors and politicians. They'd been building the system for over a century, with my grandmother's diary corroborating names and dates going back 60 years. 3 weeks later, Rodriguez drove me to the federal courthouse in a bulletproof SUV with 2 more agents following behind us. The building looked like a concrete fortress with metal detectors at every entrance and guards checking everyone's ID twice. Rodriguez walked me through the underground parking garage and up a private elevator while explaining that Thomas would be in the gallery watching. My hands started shaking when we entered the courtroom, and I saw him sitting in the 3rd row wearing his best suit and staring at me. The prosecutor led me to the witness stand where I had to swear on a Bible to tell the truth, while Thomas kept his eyes locked on mine. I described the forced medical exams where that unlicensed doctor checked my reproductive system and declared me ready for breeding. The grand jury members wrote notes as I explained the breeding charts covering our dining room walls with genetic calculations and optimal mating schedules. Thomas started shaking his head when I told them about the sedatives he brought that day to make me more cooperative. His mouth formed the word liar over and over until the judge warned him to stop or face removal from the courtroom. My voice cracked when I described finding my grandmother's diary and the escape plan that failed when they caught me. After 3 hours of testimony, Rodriguez led me back through the underground tunnels to avoid the reporters gathered outside. She told me Lucas had been arrested that morning for trying to bribe a federal agent with $500,000 for my location. The money came from an offshore account connected to dozens of families in their genetic preservation network across 12 states. Federal agents were now tracking every transaction and freezing accounts, while more arrests happened hourly. Back at the witness facility, I met 3 other girls who'd escaped from similar families, and we sat in the common room sharing our stories. One girl named Katie joked about making t-shirts that said, "I survived a breeding cult," which made us all laugh for the first time in months. We compared notes about the medical exams and breeding schedules, and realized our families all used the same unlicensed doctors. Katie's family had tried to breed her with her uncle when she turned 16, but she'd run away to a homeless shelter. Another girl showed us scars from where her father had branded her with a family crest to mark her as breeding stock. We stayed up late eating microwave popcorn and finding dark humor in experiences that would horrify normal people. 3 months after my escape, Mom appeared on a conservative talk show crying about her stolen daughter while showing my baby photos. She wore her best church dress and held a tissue while telling the host how the government had kidnapped her child. The host ranted about attacks on traditional families and religious freedom, while Mom nodded and dabbed at her eyes. Within hours, the video went viral with hashtag #SaveEmma trending, and thousands of people calling me a victim of government overreach. Counter-protesters surrounded the witness facility the next morning, carrying signs with my school photo and demanding I be returned to my family. Security added extra guards and installed cameras on every corner, but the crowd kept growing larger and angrier each day. I couldn't leave for supervised outings anymore because protesters would recognize me and start screaming that I was being brainwashed. The walls meant to protect me felt like another prison as I watched freedom through bulletproof windows. Rodriguez visited that afternoon with files showing my family's connection to 6 suspicious deaths over 40 years. Each woman had tried to leave or refused an arranged marriage before dying in accidents or supposed suicides. I recognized 3 names from my grandmother's diary, including a cousin who'd fallen downstairs the week before her planned escape. The patterns were obvious once you looked at them all together, with similar injuries and timelines that didn't make sense. Rodriguez said the FBI was exhuming bodies for new autopsies, but warned me this would make my family more dangerous. That night, I noticed a black car idling outside the facility just beyond the security lights. It sat there for hours with the engine running and tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. Security said they couldn't do anything unless someone got out or made threats, but we all knew who it was. Sleep became impossible without checking the window every hour to see if the car had moved closer. During a fire drill 2 days later, Amy walked calmly out the emergency exit and got into a black SUV that had been waiting. Security footage showed her looking directly at the camera before getting in like she wanted us to know it was her choice. 2 days after that, her family released a video of Amy sitting in her childhood bedroom saying she'd been brainwashed by feminists. Her eyes looked empty and unfocused like they'd drugged her, but she recited her lines about wanting to return home. The prosecutor called an emergency meeting to warn me that Amy's recantation was destroying our case. 3 more witnesses had gone silent after family contact and refused to testify or answer FBI calls. The defense lawyers were painting this as a government conspiracy to destroy religious families who just wanted to preserve their traditions. Every news channel ran segments debating whether we were victims or liars trying to destroy our parents' reputations. 4 months after my escape, my parents posted my childhood medical records online, including psychiatric evaluations. Thomas mouthing liar in court while Emma describes the sedatives he brought. That's an interesting reaction from someone who supposedly believes this is all righteous and proper. Makes me wonder if he knows exactly how wrong it was, but just doesn't care about anything except maintaining the family system. The evaluations painted me as delusional and prone to making up stories for attention, but didn't mention the doctors worked for the network. Hashtag Emma is lying started trending within hours as people dissected every word looking for proof I was crazy. Death threats flooded the FBI tip line from strangers saying I deserved whatever my family had planned for me. My old teacher, Ms. June, took the stand 2 weeks later, and I watched from behind the prosecutor's table as she pulled out a thick folder of photos she'd been taking since I was 14. She spread them across the evidence table, showing bruises on my arms, scars from when Mom would grab me during breeding lectures and marks on my neck from Thomas practicing his hold on me. The defense lawyer jumped up asking how she got these photos and why she never reported anything to child services if she was so worried. Ms. June's hands shook as she explained she'd tried reporting 3 times, but my parents always had documentation saying I was clumsy and hurt myself. The lawyer brought up her DUI from 10 years ago and suggested maybe she had other reasons for taking pictures of a student. I wanted to stand up and defend her, but the prosecutor grabbed my arm, keeping me in my seat. After court that day, I met with a trauma counselor who worked with people who'd escaped from cults, and she explained that my constant checking of doors and windows was normal for someone with PTSD. She told me about escaping her own family's religious group 20 years ago, and how she still jumped when someone knocked on her door. We sat in her office for 2 hours as she helped me understand that the nightmares and the way I couldn't eat certain foods anymore were my brain's way of protecting me from danger. Rachel testified the next morning through a video link from somewhere the FBI wouldn't tell me about for her safety. She described helping 18 girls escape over the past 5 years, and the defense kept objecting every 30 seconds trying to stop her testimony. Rachel just kept talking, naming dates and locations and girls who'd gotten away, including 3 from Thomas's immediate family. She pulled out her phone and showed recordings she'd been making for years of network members discussing their breeding programs. The prosecutor played Rachel's recordings in the courtroom, and Thomas's voice filled the room clear as day, talking about what would happen when they got me back. Once we get her back, she'll need intensive correction. The basement is ready. Everyone in the courtroom went quiet when they heard Dad discussing failed breeding stock and describing what happened to women who couldn't produce proper offspring. The judge called a recess, and I saw 2 jurors crying as they left the courtroom. 3 days later, the judge announced he'd received death threats and needed federal protection to continue the trial. 2 jurors asked to be excused, saying they were scared for their families after someone left dead animals on their doorsteps. The defense filed for a mistrial, claiming the media coverage had made it impossible to get a fair trial. I sat there watching everything I'd fought for start to fall apart as the judge considered their motion. He denied it, but warned that any more incidents would force him to declare a mistrial. 5 months after my escape, I started taking online classes to finish high school while living in the safe house. I'd sit at the kitchen table doing algebra homework with 2 FBI agents in the living room monitoring security cameras. Writing an essay about the Constitution felt weird when I thought about how my family had twisted the idea of freedom to mean they could do whatever they wanted to their daughters. Lucas called the prosecutor's office one morning saying he wanted to make a deal. He showed up with his lawyer and spent 6 hours describing breeding programs in 43 states with shared databases of genetic matches. Some families traded daughters like baseball cards trying to get the best genetic combinations. His testimony changed everything, because now it wasn't just about my family, but about hundreds of families across the country doing the same thing. Mom got arrested on conspiracy charges the next day after Lucas told them about 3 correction procedures she'd personally supervised on girls who'd tried to resist. The judge let her out on house arrest with an ankle monitor, but the photos of her leaving court showed someone I barely recognized with her perfect hair messy and her designer clothes wrinkled. I was doing homework when Rachel called me crying about a girl named Amy from her network who'd been found dead in her apartment. The police ruled it suicide, but Rachel knew Amy was about to testify next week about her own family's breeding program. We both knew it could have been either of us in that apartment. Thomas wasn't supposed to contact me, but I woke up one morning to find messages from a fake social media account with photos of me at the foster home, walking into the courthouse, even sitting in the safe house kitchen doing homework. The FBI went crazy trying to figure out how he'd gotten these pictures when I was supposed to be under complete protection. They found a tracking device in my backpack and realized someone on the inside was helping my family keep tabs on me. 6 months passed with me bouncing between safe houses every few weeks while the FBI tried to figure out who was leaking my location to the family network. They finally caught Agent Daniels passing information to his wife, who came from one of the breeding families in Georgia, and everything had to be moved again immediately. I was so tired of running and packing and never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe, but stopping meant they'd find me and drag me back, or worse. The morning they moved me to the 5th safe house, my phone rang with Lucas calling from a number I didn't recognize. His voice was shaking as he told me Dad had been found dead in his cell, hanging from a bedsheet even though he'd been on suicide watch. Lucas said Dad had just agreed to testify about the network's leadership in exchange for a reduced sentence, and now he was dead less than 12 hours later. The guards claimed suicide, but the timing was too perfect, and the investigation split between murder and suicide theories, while the prosecutors scrambled to save their case. Without Dad's testimony, everything rested on me and Lucas telling our stories to a jury that the defense was already working to poison against us. The defense lawyers brought in experts who talked about false memory syndrome and mass hysteria, explaining how siblings could create shared delusions to explain family trauma. I watched the jury members' faces change from sympathy to doubt as these doctors in expensive suits explained how the human mind could invent elaborate stories to cope with ordinary family dysfunction. Rodriguez found me crying in the courthouse bathroom after a particularly brutal day of testimony where they'd painted me as a mentally unstable teenager seeking attention. She sat on the dirty floor with me and admitted she'd been removed from the case after her own family started getting threats, but promised to keep helping unofficially, even if it meant risking her career. Mom took the stand the next week wearing a black dress and pearls, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she told the jury I'd always been troubled and they'd tried everything to help me. She produced medical records from doctors I'd never seen, therapy notes from sessions that never happened, prescriptions for medications I'd never taken. Her performance was perfect as she described herself as a grieving widow and mother who'd lost her husband to suicide and her daughter to mental illness. The jury deliberated for 3 days while protesters filled the courthouse steps with signs calling me either a brave survivor or a lying attention seeker. I couldn't eat anything and barely slept, just sat in my hotel room reading grandmother's diary over and over, finding strength in the stories of women who'd fought the same battle before me. On the second day of deliberations, a juror got dismissed after someone left photos of her kids at her house with a note about keeping quiet, and the alternate who replaced her had a last name I recognized from the network list. The judge refused to dismiss the new juror without concrete proof of bias, even though I could see the family resemblance to one of the Georgia breeding families in her face. Lucas called me from the hospital 2 days later with his jaw wired shut after 3 men jumped him in protective custody and beat him so badly his spleen ruptured. He could barely talk but refused to recant his testimony, even though I could hear the fear in every word he managed to get out. I visited him the next morning and held his hand while machines beeped around us, reminding him why we were fighting and that backing down now meant they'd won. Later that day, I sat in a courthouse bathroom stall listening to two women at the sinks discussing our case like it was a TV show. One said I was obviously lying for attention because no real family would do such horrible things, while the other agreed and mentioned her own daughter made up stories too when she didn't get her way. They walked out laughing about crazy teenagers while I sat there realizing how impossible our truth sounded to normal people who'd never seen what families could do behind closed doors. The verdict came back that afternoon with the foreman reading in a shaky voice that they found Thomas guilty of attempted kidnapping, but not guilty on the conspiracy charges. Mom was found not guilty on all counts, and the breeding network charges were dismissed for insufficient evidence despite boxes of documentation we'd provided. The room spun as the judge thanked the jury for their service and announced Thomas would be sentenced to 5 years, probably out in 2 with good behavior. Lucas getting jumped in protective custody with a ruptured spleen but still refusing to back down? That's the kind of stubborn courage that runs in families. Just pointed in the right direction this time. Mom smiled at me from across the courtroom while her lawyer patted her shoulder and Thomas's lawyer started talking about appeals. Rodriguez caught me outside the courthouse and pressed a flash drive into my hand before walking away without a word. That night I found copies of every document the FBI had collected about the breeding network, including internal emails between family members discussing which cousins to pair for optimal genetics. Within 3 days, the Washington Post called asking if I'd confirmed details from leaked documents they'd received, and I knew Rodriguez had sent copies to multiple news outlets. The story broke on Sunday morning with a front-page headline about secret breeding networks operating across 12 states. My phone rang non-stop as 3 more girls who'd escaped years ago contacted reporters with their own stories of forced cousin marriages and breeding calendars. Mom held a press conference on the courthouse steps 2 days later, wearing her best suit and pearl necklace, while announcing a lawsuit against the government for religious persecution. She claimed the settlement money would help other traditional families defend their constitutional rights to arrange marriages within their communities. Behind her stood 3 teenage cousins I recognized from family reunions, and my stomach dropped, knowing they were next in line for breeding assignments. The reporter from 60 Minutes called that afternoon, asking if I'd do an exclusive interview about my escape in the network. Rodriguez warned me that going public would paint a target on my back, but hiding hadn't protected me anyway. I agreed to the interview and spent the next week gathering every piece of evidence, including grandmother's diary and the breeding charts Mom had made. 8 months after my escape, Ms. June showed up at my apartment with a manila envelope containing my high school transcripts. Despite everything, I had enough credits to graduate, and she'd convinced the school board to issue my diploma based on completed coursework. I sat on my couch holding that piece of paper and crying because it meant I'd done something they never wanted for their breeding stock. The 60 Minutes crew arrived the following week and transformed my living room into a makeshift studio with lights and cameras. I spread the breeding charts across the coffee table and showed them the medical records from the unlicensed doctor who'd examined my reproductive system. The interviewer's face went pale when I opened grandmother's diary to the pages describing what happened to girls who refused their breeding assignments. When she asked if I regretted leaving my family, I didn't hesitate before answering that I only regretted not leaving sooner. The interview aired to 12 million viewers on a Sunday night, and within minutes my phone exploded with notifications. Some messages called me brave, while others contained death threats and accusations that I'd betrayed my race. 3 congresswomen announced investigations into breeding networks the next morning, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk about cousin marriages. Mom appeared on Fox News calling me mentally ill and claiming I'd been brainwashed by liberal professors into hating my heritage. More survivors started contacting me after seeing the interview, including a girl who'd been paired with her uncle at 14. I connected them with the underground network that had helped me escape and started building a support system for escapees. Rachel called crying because 4 girls had reached out after seeing my story and were planning their own escapes. We spent hours on the phone coordinating safe houses and creating fake identities for girls whose families would hunt them down. 2 weeks later, the prison called to inform me that Thomas had been killed by another inmate who'd shanked him in the shower. The investigation revealed the killer had no connection to me or my family, but Thomas had apparently been trying to recruit white supremacists for the breeding network. I felt nothing but relief knowing one less predator could hurt girls like me. The FBI launched simultaneous raids on 12 network families based on tips that poured in after the interview aired. 14 children were removed from homes where breeding preparations had already begun, including a 13-year-old whose parents had picked her future husband. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, recognizing the same terror in those kids' faces that I'd felt the night I ran. 3 of the rescued teenagers testified about their families preparing them for breeding duties, and this time the prosecutor had enough evidence. Mom was arrested on new charges of conspiracy to commit child abuse and trafficking of minors for reproductive purposes. The judge denied bail after reviewing testimony about the network's history of making witnesses disappear. I watched Mom in her orange jumpsuit at the arraignment looking nothing like the perfect Southern matriarch who'd controlled every aspect of my life. Other network families started turning on each other to get reduced sentences, and the whole sick system began falling apart. The prosecutor called to tell me 17 more people had been arrested, including the unlicensed doctor and several family patriarchs. My older brother got picked up for helping transport underage cousins across state lines for breeding meetings. Even relatives who'd seemed normal were exposed as active participants in the network's operations. The investigation expanded to other states as more survivors came forward with evidence of similar breeding programs. Within 6 months, the network that had operated for generations was completely exposed, and most of its leaders were facing serious prison time. Lucas ended up in witness protection after testifying against the rest of the family in the new trials that kept coming. The marshals moved him somewhere out west and gave him a new name nobody would tell me. A month later, I got a letter forwarded through the prosecutor's office where he apologized for everything, for being too weak to protect me when he knew what was happening. He wrote that he was in therapy now, trying to understand why he chose comfort over doing the right thing. The letter sat in my desk drawer for weeks before I could read it again without shaking. I didn't forgive him, but I kept it. Congress actually passed a law 6 months later, making forced genetic matching and breeding programs federal crimes with mandatory prison time. They called it Emma's Law, which felt weird seeing my name on the news next to pictures of the Capitol building. The lobbying from certain groups weakened some parts, but it was still something real that would protect other kids. I stood next to 12 other survivors when the president signed it and tried not to cry when reporters asked how it felt to change history. College started that fall, and I used my real name for the first time in over a year. My major was social work because I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life now. The nightmares still came most nights, and I jumped whenever someone touched me unexpectedly, but my therapist said that was normal after everything. My roommate knew my whole story from the news coverage, but she never treated me like I was broken or special. We just studied together and complained about professors like normal students. Mom's trial took 8 months, but the jury only needed 2 hours to convict her on all charges. The judge gave her 25 years, and she stood there claiming she was just protecting our family's legacy, right until they put her in handcuffs. She looked at me one last time as the bailiffs led her away, but I kept my eyes on my phone. That woman wasn't my mother anymore, and hadn't been for a long time. Rachel and I started running a legitimate organization to help kids escape from families like ours, using everything we'd learned underground. We had real lawyers now, and safe houses that weren't secret, and protocols that didn't require hiding from the FBI. The network grandmother wrote about in her diary had become something official with business cards and a website. Therapy happened twice a week in an office with plants and soft chairs where I learned about PTSD and trauma responses. I still checked every lock 3 times and sat with my back to walls in restaurants and startled when men got too close. My therapist kept reminding me that healing wasn't a straight line, and some days would be harder than others. She was right, because some mornings I couldn't get out of bed, and other days I felt almost normal. Then a young cousin I'd never met called my emergency phone one night, whispering that her parents were planning her marriage to someone 30 years older. I activated our network immediately and walked her through the escape plan step by step while Rachel contacted the authorities in her state. 3 days later, she was safe in foster care, and her parents were under investigation. Every rescue broke the cycle a little more. Grandmother's grave was in the old family cemetery, but I'd never visited until that spring. I brought fresh flowers and the diary that had saved my life, and so many others. I sat on the grass and told her about the network collapsing and the new laws and all the girls who were free because she'd been brave enough to write everything down. The headstone was simple granite, but I traced her name with my finger and thanked her for documenting the truth, even when it was dangerous. The survivor support group met every Thursday in a church basement where we sat in a circle and shared our stories. New escapees would show up with the same haunted look I'd had, and I'd tell them it gets better even when it doesn't feel like it will. Not perfect and not easy, but better, I always said. You're free now, and that's everything that matters. They usually cried, and I held their hands and remembered being 17 and terrified and sure I'd never escape. 25 years for Mom, but she still thinks she was protecting their legacy? How does someone's brain work like that, seeing breeding programs as protection instead of harm? Now I was 19 and sitting in my dorm room studying for a social work exam while my roommate brought me coffee, and we joked about how our statistics professor looked like a confused owl. Outside my window, students walked to class without reading charts or genetic preservation meetings or forced marriages waiting for them. I was exactly what my family never wanted me to be. 19, unmarried, childless, and completely free to choose my own future. The diary sat on my bookshelf between my textbooks, a daily reminder of where I came from and why I'd keep fighting for every girl still trapped in families that saw them as breeding stock instead of human beings. My phone buzzed with another emergency call from a cousin in Georgia, and I answered it immediately because this was my life now, my choice, my purpose that nobody could take away. Thanks for letting me wonder right alongside you. It's always interesting to see where curiosity takes us. Take care out there. Like the video. It helps more than you think.